There have been modest changes, I think all improving the original proposal. I want to mention that we received 4.3 million public comments, the most we've ever gotten on any other EPA regulation. So we listened to the public. The carbon reduction goal actually increased from 30% to 32%. We took energy efficiency out as a requirement because there was some concern about legal vulnerability. Utilities said they didn't really have a whole lot of control over what their consumers do on the energy efficiency side. It's not because we don't think energy efficiency is absolutely important. We think it is, but it's not a requirement of this plan. And some of the state goals were changed. So for instance, New York State has a lower carbon reduction target. It's now 20%, which I think the state will easily achieve. Well, New York State and other states said that they started working on carbon pollution reduction first. They were early adopters, and they should not be penalized because they made some early reductions. And that made sense to us. You know, we spent a lot of time talking to all states in New York and other northeastern states that are part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, which is a cap and trade program. They wanted some extra credit for acting early, and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative actually has achieved a 40% reduction in carbon pollution in the affected states. So we thought their point was a reasonable one, a fair one, and so we made an adjustment. States that are heavily dependent on coal will have a much tougher time achieving the carbon reduction goals. The nationwide goal is a 32% reduction by 2030. And every state has a different energy mix. So it's not a uniform goal for every state. So New York, for instance, only relies on coal for 3.5% of its electricity. So it's a shorter walk than if you're Indiana or West Virginia, and we are very mindful of how challenging it'll be in those states. We don't want people to lose jobs, but we also can't have a lowest common denominator on such an important issue like climate change. And so, you know, the Labor Department will work with the states that are really coal dependent on a transition to try to preserve as many jobs as possible while there's a transition to cleaner energy sources. Every state will have lots of options. The way EPA developed this regulation is quite different than the way we've done it in the past. Typically, let's say you've got a pollutant that we're all concerned about, like mercury, which is a potent neurotoxin and affects kids' ability to learn. The way EPA traditionally regulated mercury is we came up with the appropriate number and said, power plant A, you cannot emit more than this amount of mercury. We're not doing that with this carbon reduction rule. What we're saying is, state of West Virginia or state of New York, here is your carbon reduction goal, and you essentially have a menu of things to choose from on how you get there. You can really ramp up on renewable energy sources like solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, fuel cells. You can build new power plants as long as you achieve your state goal. You can make tremendous new investment in renewables. Essentially everything's on the table. So it gives the states lots of flexibility, but it also establishes an important binding goal. And I think it puts New York in a good position, because think about it, we don't produce coal in New York State. Not only do we not burn a lot of coal, there are no coal mines in New York, but what we do have in New York is a lot of wind and water and sun. Those are our indigenous energy sources that we think are poised for a dramatic increase. I've read both sides of this. Some people believe there's a rush to natural gas. Others believe that, in fact, there's going to be a rush to renewables and not gas. But it's really up to each state to decide. And, I think a really, really important point is before a state submits their compliance plan to EPA, which is due September of 2016, they're required to allow for public input. So public hearings, opportunities to put in written comments. So for residents of New York who want a voice in what they want New York's energy future to look like, they should not be shy about sharing those views with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation before September 2016, because that's when the first draft plan is due to the EPA for our review. People describe natural gas as a bridge to a cleaner energy future like efficiency and renewables, that it emits half the amount of carbon pollution than coal, but it also emits half the amount of carbon pollution compared to coal. So it's still a fair amount of carbon. So I think we are sending a pretty strong market signal toward investments in renewable energy sources and also energy efficiency. The cheapest power plant is one you don't have to build. And we think of energy efficiency as, oh, it's so 1980s, been there, done that. But there is so much more we can do in our buildings, in our appliances, in so many sectors to drive down the use of energy. And that's where the real consumer savings will also come in. Initially, there will be some increase in cost, but our analysis is that by the time this is fully in effect, in 2030, the average American will see an $8 per month reduction in their utility bill. So over time, we will see savings. A lot of that will be influenced by what choices the states make. Do they go for more expensive energy options, less expensive, cleaner, dirtier? And with renewables, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg. The more demand, the price comes down. And I've been astonished at the increased interest and commitment in solar, for instance, all over the state. I'm fortunate to do a lot of public meetings on energy issues and climate change. And there's always someone who raises their hand and says, Judith, I need to tell you about solarized Syracuse or solarized Rochester. And there's a growing number of people who are taking their energy decisions into their own hands. And there's some good financial incentives. So they're putting solar panels on their rooftops at a record rate. EPA is very committed to addressing environmental justice. And in a lot of low-income communities, people are tenants. They don't own their own homes. And so we will provide some early economic support for energy efficiency in low-income communities. So it'll provide not only cleaner air, but also some benefits on your monthly utility bill. Low-income communities, senior citizens on fixed incomes, we think, when you look at all of the factors here, we think cleaner air makes a lot of economic sense. You want to look at the broader picture, avoided asthma attacks, avoided hospitalizations. But there's also the reality of people having to pay their monthly utility bill. So we want to make this as smooth a transition as possible. The Clean Air Act does direct EPA to look at health impacts, and so I want to approach this in two ways. One is when you reduce scorching hot summer days due to climate change, that has tremendous health benefits. People are dying from heat stroke, respiratory illness, heart disease. All of that helps on the health side. But in addition, when you're driving down carbon pollution, we have this additional benefit of we're also reducing air pollutants that cause smog and soot by about 25%. So that'll have some real health benefits to New Yorkers as well. And a lot of the carbon pollution and soot and smog pollution hits New York from out-of-state sources, from the Midwest, from Pennsylvania. So this is the first national requirement to reduce carbon pollution. New York and the Northeast have been pretty active on this front, but Midwestern states and Pennsylvania have not. So the health benefits to New York residents are going to be quite significant in finally having a national requirement that every single state has to comply with. For upstate New York, we're all downwind from the Ohio River Valley, and so EPA has looked at avoided asthma attacks, avoided heart attacks, avoided respiratory disease, and it's quite significant. This is just one regulation, but we believe it's going to make a pretty dramatic shift in the way the United States produces electricity. Talk to any parent. There are more kids at their kids' school with inhalers because of asthma. Some scientists are saying that nighttime temperatures are staying warmer. Usually it cools down at night, but that's not happening this summer, so they're seeing more hospital admissions in the nighttime hours for people who are struggling with heat. I think you don't have to have a PhD in climate science to look around and already see the impacts on health and our environment. We're going to win. The Supreme Court actually told EPA that carbon is a pollutant and we should regulate it. So there are some critics who believe that this regulation doesn't go far enough. When you look at the science and how dramatically our planet is warming, a 32% reduction in carbon pollution from fossil fuel plants is not going far enough. And that might be a fair criticism, but when we developed the regulation, it had to be done within the four corners of the Clean Air Act. So we're very confident of two things. One is we know it will be challenged in court. A number of attorneys general from coal-producing states have already announced that. And at the same time, New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman announced that he will support these regulations in court. So we're fairly confident that we will win a legal challenge. The second challenge is in Congress. A bill had already passed the House that would direct EPA not to implement this regulation until all legal challenges are resolved. And that, of course, could take years. We don't feel like we've got time to delay this any further. And so I don't know what's going to happen in Congress, but Congress is always free to block any regulatory agency from implementing a regulation through a new law on the books. And we will have to see what the Senate and the House do. So far, both houses have not passed identical bills, but there is a bill introduced in the Senate to also block our authority here. It is an aging grid, and a bunch of coal plants were built when Dwight Eisenhower was president. So these are old plants that many argue were being phased out anyway. But we definitely took reliability very seriously when we crafted this regulation, because you have to keep the lights on. And so there's an off-ramp from the reg if it's proven that taking a particular power plant offline permanently or part of the time would affect reliability, then adjustments are made. But quite honestly, if you look at what Wall Street is saying about this and look at what Mike Bloomberg has said about this, the market is having more to do with taking coal offline than any EPA regulation, and I think that's true. EPA is completely nonpartisan, and we don't look at polls when we do regulations. We look at the law and we look at science. And I think the most important thing is for us to keep educating the public about the immense challenges of climate change. And when people fully grasp how serious this issue is, inevitably, the question then turns to, what can we do? And there needs to be things that we can do. You can't just put a big problem on the table and not give people options and solutions. So last year, for instance, 2014 was the hottest year on record. 2015 is slated to be even hotter. There are real live impacts of this weather. There are real live impacts of drought, of wildfires. Our warming planet, our rising sea level is having pretty profound economic and environmental impacts now. And unfortunately, it's slated just to get worse. I took a look at a scientific paper that looked at 12,000 different peer-reviewed studies on climate change. And the authors were looking at what was the conclusion. What percentage of scientists said that climate change is happening and is primarily caused by human activities? And it was 98% of scientists agree that there is a consensus on climate change. And so I think, the kind of the swirling around climate change is or isn't here, that ship has sailed. It is here, and now we have to do something about it. It's not going to be free. There are economic impacts, but I did a lot of work after Hurricane Sandy hit New York and New Jersey. Tremendous human suffering. 117 people tragically lost their lives. The federal government came up with $60 billion to help rebuild New York and New Jersey. So that was one storm, 2 states, $60 billion. There will be other Hurricane Sandys, and so the sooner we can drive down carbon pollution that contributes to not just warming weather, but increased sea level rise, more intense storms. I can't say that climate change caused Hurricane Sandy, but what I can say is that the warmer ocean temperatures in late October caused Sandy to be more intense than it would have been. And so there are real economic benefits to addressing the impact of climate change. And I think that, along with the health benefits, need to be part of the equation, not just the cost to utility companies. A community that's almost entirely dependent on a coal plant needs to start planning for a transition. Nothing's going to happen overnight. The effective date, the endpoint on this regulation is 2030. So we've got some time. We want to preserve local jobs. We want to support local economies. But we also need to really step up on this global issue. And so I think planning for investments in cleaner energy sources would be wise. Some retraining of workers needs to happen. There needs to be a social safety net for people who may lose their jobs because of this. And EPA is not unsympathetic. We don't want people losing their jobs, but we also have to deal with climate change. So many people around the globe have actually become climate refugees. There are coastal communities that are so hard hit by both sea level rise and intense storms that we're already seeing a migration of thousands of people. The U.S. military lists climate change as one of the greatest security threats facing the globe. So the time to take action on climate change was actually yesterday. We've got to get going, and I think the President's Clean Power Plan puts us on a really good course for action.